Well, gentlemen, we've had these protests for a week. As I said, some of them are in the name of George Floyd, no doubt very genuine and peaceful, and I think, given recent history, fairly justified protests. The others are using the protests, I think, to advance another highly partisan agenda in a US election year, some to the far left and some, in some places, to the far right. How does anyone at this time, with the November election looming, and I've watched a lot of the coverage, some channels are pushing their agenda and other networks are pulling their own agenda. How do you bring America together in a time like this, Tim Blair?
Well, in the short term, you definitely don't. I mean, this is, older folk will recall the riots in Chicago in 1968 at the Democrat Convention. This is Chicago gone national. And and you're right to point out that although these protests began in direct response to George Floyd's death at the hands of police, they long ago ceased to be about that, and they're now about a whole suite of generally anti-Trump positions. I mean, when you've got white kids stealing surfboards from Santa Monica sports shops, that's not much to do with racial injustice.
Now, we saw last night 3,000 odd protesters march through Macquarie Street in Sydney in the CBD. They say in solidarity with the US protests, but also on behalf of Indigenous issues. Here in Melbourne this weekend, thousands more are expected to also protest. I've got to ask you, Luke, are these protests genuinely about George Floyd, or are we seeing around the world, again, these protests have been picked up by activists? We've seen them in London, and we obviously saw them in Sydney last night.
Yeah, you're right. It's a risk, isn't it, Peter? It's hard to know. You'd like to think that the motivations are genuine. I mean, the brutal killing of George Floyd at the hands, it would seem, of that police officer and with 3 or 4 other officers looking on was appalling. So if the march, if the protest is about behaviour of police, heavy-handedness, then maybe there's something to that over the oceans, showing strength from Australia. But I don't know about the ramping up of the issue here. I note that a number of Greens MPs, it would seem, joined with the family of that young fella in Sydney from last night to make a statement, in particular about the police officer, that he should be arrested and charged. And of course, we had the Commissioner in Sydney apologise, rightly, I thought, today. It's very hard. I wasn't there. I heard some of the abuse thrown the way of the threat thrown the way of the police officers. So you don't know. I've never been a police officer. I don't know how far you need to be pushed that you start to sweep someone's legs out and then haul them away. I know the incarceration issue, and you know this well because you were helping to run the country when we had Prime Minister Abbott in power, who did so much and has done over his life so much good for Indigenous Australia. To come back at the start, I hope that the protest is about what happened in America. If there's an issue here with this one officer, it needs to be dealt with. But I don't know that we necessarily have to accept that how things are there are indeed how things are here.
Yeah, and look, let's just pick up on that issue with the New South Wales police officer. The Commissioner was out there today. I think I've got some vision of the attack in relation to the Indigenous boy where his legs were swept out from under him. We'll play that on the screen now. And of course, on radio this morning, Radio 2GB, I think it was Ben Fordham's program, the New South Wales Police Commissioner apologised. Now, David Elliott, who is the New South Wales Police Minister, in part defended the behaviour of police given what he says were the alleged behaviour of the young man before the incident. Let's have a listen to David Elliott.
I was just as disturbed about the threat from a young person to physically assault a police officer as I was with the response from the police officer. The important message here is that Sydney is not Minnesota, and the situation that we had 2 days ago in Sydney was not unprovoked. The response from the police was not unprovoked.
Tim, picking up what Luke just said then, we can't conflate the two places, the US and Australia. But also, after Fuller's apology on 2GB, I listened to a lot of people calling in, and I had a bit of a scan around online as well. A lot of people were pretty cranky, actually, that the Commissioner, before there's been this investigation, was quick to apologise for how the police officer behaved, particularly when they say the young man should never speak to police like that. And, we, they say, the callers, were never brought up to treat anyone in uniform like that. Where do we stand?
I think fairly obviously, the officer was provoked. And in a circumstance where someone, a police officer, is entitled to use some force to carry out his or her job, it's certainly not a clever move to provoke an officer. It's perhaps, I think the argument here is about the dimension of the officer's response and the fact that it looked dreadful. But you do have to say, as the police minister pointed out, it wasn't one-way traffic here. There was a level of provocation. And older Australians are understandably, I think, taken aback by the fact that that behaviour from the young man is largely excused or expected or it should be just ignored. No, it shouldn't be. There should be a response. It shouldn't be as aggressive as it was.
Yeah, I tell you what, I'm showing my age here, but if I ever complained to my parents about a police officer or a teacher, I was always in the wrong and they were always in the right. And I can remember a session too, we really are dating ourselves.